On the morning of September 14th, 2017, 14-year-old Andrew Gosden left his home in Doncaster, England, dressed for school. But several hours later, Andrew returned home, changed his clothes, went to the bank and withdrew almost all the money he had in his account, and then went to the station and bought a one-way train ticket to London. At 11:25 that morning, CCTV cameras captured an image of Andrew leaving King's Cross Station in London. That was the last time anyone ever saw Andrew. 2 decades later, investigators still have no idea why Andrew went to London or where he went after he left the station. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to True Crime Unsolved. Hey, hang on a second. Sean, what are you wearing?
Dude, don't use my name. I'm trying to be anonymous online right now. Shh.
Bro, everyone here already knows who you are. Besides, the only way to truly remain anonymous online is to use a VPN. Not just any VPN, the best one, Proton VPN.
Oh, that's right. We talked about that. All right, I guess I can take this off. The hat and sunglasses really don't do much anyway, especially compared to Proton VPN, which has features like 20,681 servers in 148 countries, or their seamless integration with streamers like Netflix and Amazon.
Don't forget their blazing fast connections or their built-in ad blocker. Not to mention the transparent open source software that lets you see for yourself just how safe and secure you are when using it.
If Proton VPN were a cool hat like this, I would happily hand it out to each and every one of our viewers. But since it's not a hat and it's a VPN, I guess the next best thing we can do is help them get it for a really good price.
Because today's video is sponsored by Proton, our viewers can get it for 70% off right now. All you have to do is click the special promo link in the description of this video, or just go to protonvpn.com/TCU. Again, that's protonvpn.com/TCU.
Sounds like a good deal. All right, let's get into today's case.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to True Crime Unsolved. I'm Miles Reeve. I'm here as always with my buddy Sean Cahill. This is the place where we tackle the stories that the TV networks won't touch. Unsolved homicides, missing persons cases, stories without an ending. Sean, what are we getting into today?
The house, changed his clothes, got as much money as he could, and took some personal belongings and took this train. Why? We don't know. To meet somebody, because he just wanted to play hooky. No one's been able to figure out what happened to him. So we're going to dive deep into this one because there's a lot of twists and turns, a lot of strange facts along the way, some of them contradicting each other. That lead us to basically a 19-year-old mystery. This is one of these old ones that actually kind of reminds me, Miles, of Jennifer Kessie, not just because of how old it is, but because we have this really important, closed circuit television footage of Andrew at the train station. So we know he got to London, but then it feels like the answer to the mystery happens sort of out of frame, off camera, just like with Jennifer Kessie. And it's just frustrating, right? You stare at this picture of this young guy coming off a train, going into a fate that no one's been able to determine yet. So with that said, there's a lot to talk about, so I'm going to kick it back to you, Miles. Why don't we just get into Andrew's background and take it from there?
Absolutely. So let's just get into a little bit on who Andrew was, and so we can understand where he came from, where he was at in his life, and all of that. So Andrew's full name was Andrew Paul Gosden. He was born July 10th, 1993. So his birthday actually just passed, his birthday just passed a little while ago. Andrew was 14 when he went missing, like we said up top. So if he was alive, he would actually be 31 years old, if he is alive, which he may be. We're not sure. And as Sean mentioned, Andrew grew up in a place called Doncaster, which is in South Yorkshire. Now, I know that we actually do have a lot of viewers in the UK. Our analytics always show that, which is pretty awesome. So Andrew lived with his father, whose name was Kevin, his mother, whose name was Glennie, and his older sister, whose name was Charlotte. Now, Andrew's family were observant Anglican Christians, and from everything we've been able to find, his parents were pretty observant. They were fairly religious. Interestingly enough, they chose not to have Andrew and his sister Charlotte baptized. And when asked about it, his father, Kevin, actually said that he wanted to give his children the choice to make their own decisions in their faith. So by what we've been able to find out, Andrew had attended church pretty regularly when he was younger, but that had stopped as he had gotten into his teenage years, and he wasn't really going to church on a regular basis with his parents at this point when he was 14 years old. So Andrew's family had a nickname for him. They called him Rue. That does play an important part in some clues that we're going to get into later, so you might want to remember that. In interviews with the police and with the press later on, Andrew's family all described him as a shy, quiet kid. He was kind of mature emotionally for his age, according to his family, but he actually looked physically much younger than he was. So this was a 14-year-old kid who probably looked like he was 10, 11 years old. He was slight of build. He wasn't that tall. He had some distinguishing stuff going on. He was very highly intelligent, but he was also kind of absent-minded. He was the kind of kid who was known to like leave his keys at home, forget things, forget to turn in homework, stuff like that. According to his family, Andrew was fairly introverted. He wasn't someone who put a big emphasis on socialization. He didn't have a ton of friends outside of school. And his dad did make a point of saying to police that Andrew probably wasn't very streetwise. So he was a little bit innocent when it came to that kind of stuff. He also said that he was probably potentially vulnerable, which kind of ties into the not being streetwise. Andrew's big loves, from what we've been able to find out, were really video games and hard rock music. So he really liked the band Muse. He also liked Slipknot. He was into some metal stuff. You know, he was a kid who wore metal T-shirts. He carried his PSP around with him. As we put these biographical pieces together, you can kind of get a picture of the kind of kid that Andrew was, right? And like, look, I'm not trying to stereotype anybody. I was into this kind of music when I was a kid. I was slight of build when I was a kid. This isn't a judgment on anything. We're just trying to kind of paint a little bit of a profile on who Andrew was, so that we might be able to understand why what happened to him happened, and also the motivations for it, right? Because that's what we're here for. So bands that Andrew liked, like I said, he really liked Slipknot. He liked the band Funeral for a Friend, and he also liked the band Muse. So he liked the harder stuff, but he also liked some rock stuff. Andrew also had some pretty strong physical identifiers that really made it easy to know who he was. He wore very strong prescription glasses. He had deafness in his left ear. He also, from what we've been able to find out, he had a difficulty determining where sound was coming from. So he could get a little bit disoriented. Andrew also had an unusual physical thing going on where he had a double ridge on his right ear. And this does play into the CCTV footage and how Andrew was identified on that footage, which we'll get into later. So even though Andrew's family was Anglican, he actually attended Macaulay Catholic High School. Now, at that school, everybody said that Andrew was extremely academically gifted. He actually was like He actually was known to be a sort of genius in mathematics. He had been enrolled in the Young, Gifted, and Talented program, which I would imagine, for our friends in the States is kind of like, a special progress program, or, the kind of thing where you're given, courses that are on a higher level, to kind of prep you for the direct line to college, right? He was expected to score really, really high on his standardized tests, which in the UK are called I'm going to try to get this right, they're called the GCSEs. You always hear the Brits talking about those, and you get your A levels and your B levels and all of that stuff. And Andrew was expected to score really, really high, and everybody actually figured that he would attend Cambridge or Oxford or some, really, really high level place. Something else that's important here is that until the day of his disappearance, Andrew actually had a 100% perfect attendance record at his school. So the day that he disappeared was the first day that he had missed school, which I think is an interesting thing to note. Andrew had earlier in his life attended a 2-week residential program at Lancaster University during the summer of 2006. And he reportedly had come home very enthusiastic about the experience. So this was a kid who was actually, he may have been introverted. He may have met some stereotypes of the sort of video game playing, internalized kind of kid, but he also did show enthusiasm about things and did care about his academics. His family did say that he had friends at school, but he didn't really put an emphasis on socializing outside of school. He did spend a lot of time alone. But according to his family and according to the people that were interviewed at the school, there was no known bullying problem. Again, adults don't always know everything that's going on in children's worlds, and that includes the school. But from what we know, there was no reported bullying problem at Andrew's school for him. His family also said that they had seen no signs of depression in Andrew. So this wasn't a case where they had seen any warning signs of that, maybe he was going to disappear or maybe he was going to do some sort of self-harm. Now, one thing that I think is really important to remember is that all the members of Andrew's family described him as a home bird, which in the UK is the same as what we would call in the United States a homebody. So that's somebody who likes to chill at home. They're not going out. They're not spending a lot of time playing outdoors or anything like that. Andrew was someone who liked to stay at home, play his video games, read his books, that kind of stuff. So I think that's important because when we see what happened on that day when Andrew disappeared and the steps that he took, it is really out of character and very, very mysterious.
Yeah, and so obviously one of the first places the investigators started to look into in this case was what was Andrew's life like leading up to the days that he disappeared and took this very strange journey that was so, as Miles said, out of character for him. And they're going to go back and they're going to talk to everybody that he was around and sort of just figure out what was he up to? Is there anything unusual? Is there anything weird? Was there new people in his life? But the strange thing is there really wasn't that much. In fact, everybody that they spoke to kind of said Andrew went about his business as usual. He seems to be in his normal mood. He wasn't doing anything strange. In fact, the only thing really that popped out to them was that Andrew's 4-mile bus ride to school, and forgive me, our British viewers, I don't know off the top of my head what that would be in kilometers, which is almost certainly how you would be measuring it. But it's a 4-mile ride for us over here in the States. And he decided to walk that a couple times the week leading up to his disappearance. Now, there's nothing that weird about choosing to maybe skip the school bus and take a walk, except that Andrew didn't normally do that. And so in context with his disappearance, we look at this and we all think, especially the investigators are thinking, why would he have done that? Is it a completely innocuous reason? Like he just felt like stretching his legs. Maybe he's just working on getting a little bit more independence. Or is it possible that he was taking some time to himself to plan something like this trip? Maybe he was even meeting somebody, right? This is going to become important later. Is there a reason that he wanted to be alone for that period of time in his town by himself? We don't know. All we know is that he did it. What took place on those walks is anybody's guess. So that's the week leading up to this disappearance. The investigators wanted to focus in really up to the night before too, because this would be, you would think in a 14-year-old's mind, the critical time period, right? If he really had some big plans, if he really was going to meet somebody potentially or do something, you would think that it would have been detectable in his personality. But the family said they didn't notice anything, right? It doesn't mean that Andrew wasn't feeling nervous or didn't have something on his mind. And clearly he probably did because we know what he did the next day. But he wasn't presenting anything outwardly. There was certainly no fear, no depression. In fact, his family said that it was a normal night. They ate dinner together. They all washed dishes. Andrew even spent about an hour with his dad working on a jigsaw puzzle on the computer. So nobody had any reason to suspect that the following morning, September 14th of 2007, would be anything other than normal. And it kind of was. Andrew got up slightly late that morning for school. His family later said that he seemed a little bit irritable, but nothing out of the ordinary for a teenager, getting up and getting ready to go to school. And he left the house at the normal time that he would have to catch the bus. Now, we don't know for sure how his next movements played out, but we do know roughly what happened. At some point, when Andrew's out, allegedly waiting for the bus, his family gets ready and they all go off to their various places of work, and his sister goes to her school. And then Andrew comes back And it seems like this was obviously very deliberate, because what happens is he takes off his school uniform, puts it in the laundry machine where it's later found by his family, and then dresses in what we see him later on a CCTV camera wearing, which is a Slipknot t-shirt, jeans, with a messenger bag. So what does he bring with him? He brings his PSP, although notably not the charger. And for those of you who maybe don't know what a PSP is, 20 years ago, that was kind of like a handheld video gaming device. It meant PlayStation Portable. And Andrew had one of those. He was really into video games. So he brings that, but he doesn't bring the charger. He brings his wallet, and he also stops at an ATM and withdraws 200 pounds from his bank account, which only had 214 pounds in it. So presumably, in an ATM that only dispenses in 20-pound increments, the maximum he could have pulled was 200, and that is indeed what he took. Interestingly, though, he did leave 100 pounds at home in his bedroom that he knew he had. I think this was like birthday money or something he had received, and he chose not to bring that. So there are these clues that he probably expected to come home later, right? There's money he's leaving behind. He's not bringing the charger for the electronic device he has on him, which, you would think if he's disappearing forever and he wants to bring this electronic device, you would bring the charger. Although, again, this falls into the category of things that will later contradict, right? As we're looking at all the evidence, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But that's what he had with him. Miles, why don't I kick it to you, and we'll pick up Andrew's trail that morning at the train station.
Andrew arrives at the Doncaster railway station at approximately 9:22 a.m. Now, for those of you who aren't in the UK, which I think is the majority of our audience, to kind of make you understand what the Doncaster railway station is, basically in London itself, there's the Tube, which is like, the New York City subway system, right? And then in these suburbs that are outside of it, there's these railways that come into London, right? So that's kind of like Metro North or the Long Island Railroad, right? And there's these hubs outside of the city where people, can catch a train and then they ride in, and then they'll arrive at like the equivalent of Grand Central Station in London, and then you can kind of like shoot off onto the Tube or walk once you're in the city, right? So anyway, Andrew gets to the Doncaster railway station approximately 9:22 a.m. He asked for a ticket to London. The ticket seller offers him a return ticket. Now, this is an interesting point. So the difference in price was reportedly less than £1. So that's probably about 50 pence, which is, our equivalent of cents, right? But Andrew declines the return ticket. Why did he decline the return ticket? Nobody knows, but it is an interesting fact. And he specifically purchased a one-way ticket to London. So it is a very debated clue in the case. And I think some of the questions that come up around it is, the first most obvious thing is, was Andrew just not planning to return? Was the one-way ticket because this was a one-way trip for him and he was never coming back to Doncaster? In which case, that means that he had been planning this. He was, going to run away, and, he probably had a destination in mind. That doesn't really jive with the things that Sean just went through, with the stuff that he left behind, the fact he didn't even have a jacket. He was very lightly packed. Doesn't make sense as far as I'm concerned that this was a kid who had a final destination in mind. Maybe he was expecting someone else to drive him home. That's another thing. So if he was planning to meet someone, if he had arranged to meet someone, so to say, maybe he was expecting to get a ride back from that person. Maybe that person was older than him. Maybe that person had access to a vehicle. Was he planning to stay in London? From what we know, the family did have relatives in the city. So, and that comes up later after the disappearance, where the dad's like, assumes that Andrew would probably plan to stay in the city, and that's maybe what happened, or maybe what his original plan was, right? Was Andrew just simply inexperienced and didn't know how to buy a train ticket? And when the clerk at the booth said, "Hey, you can get a return ticket for less than £1," he was like, "No, I just want a one-way ticket." Maybe he just didn't know. That's also possible. Again, the dad has said that Andrew wasn't very streetwise. The dad has said that his son was a bit naive when it came to the ways of the world. So maybe this was just a case of like not knowing what to do, being nervous, and just insisting on the one-way ticket. Maybe he assumed that he could just buy the ticket later, or maybe it just didn't mean anything at all. No matter what, this is a fact that has been debated in online forums for years, because it is one of the only things that we know that stands out as a very strange thing, that, the one-way ticket kind of has like a weight to it, right? Like, I don't want to return. And the fact that the clerk did offer that return ticket and did tell Andrew, hey, it's only going to cost this much, and he still insisted on the one-way, does kind of stand out, right? So at approximately 9:35, 9:36, Andrew actually gets on the train that's headed towards London. A passenger who had sat next to him actually did speak to the police when she saw that Andrew was missing. She described him as being alone, very quiet, and sort of like buried in his PSP. So Andrew was riding on this train and basically just playing his video game. He was this kid just sitting there with his head buried in the video game. Nothing about him apparently suggested distress or any sort of coercion going on as far as this person saw. And they were sitting next to him, and they were sitting next to him for this whole journey to London. Now, like I was describing up top, these trains are coming in from these suburbs, right? So this isn't like going, from, a couple of blocks down the road in London. This is a long journey. So this train ride lasted a little bit less than 2 hours. And this woman was sitting next to him for that ride. And that's what she said, that Andrew was just buried in his game and, not really paying attention to what was going on around him and just sort of preoccupied with his video game. So at 11:20, Andrew's train arrives at King's Cross. Now, King's Cross Station is basically what I said earlier. It's, if I had to describe it, having been there pretty recently, it's kind of like the London version of Grand Central Station. It's a big, very, very busy place with people coming in from all over, people coming in from these suburbs on these other train lines, people running to get trains all over the place. It's a very chaotic place. It's a very busy place. And there's connections to railways going all over the Greater London area at King's Cross. At 11:25, CCTV footage captures a shot of Andrew leaving King's Cross Station through the main exit. Now, they confirmed that. Now, authorities confirmed that this was Andrew by the distinct ridges on his right ear, which we mentioned earlier. So the footage that we have here remains the last confirmed sighting of Andrew. This is the last time anyone saw Andrew Gosden anywhere. Once he crossed through those doors, really any sort of timeline that we have, any sort of confirmed timeline, is over. That's it. Like, as far as we know, Andrew walks out that door and he is never heard from again, and nobody ever has any confirmed sighting of him. Though, as you'll see later, as we get into sort of the aftermath of all of this, people have come forward with possible sightings of him and other evidence that has come up. So we'll get into that later, though. So even though Andrew didn't arrive at school that day, and as I had mentioned, he did have a perfect attendance record, the school messed up. The school actually did call the family to let them know that Andrew hadn't come to school that day, but whoever made that call screwed up, and they left the message with the wrong house. So they actually called the wrong family and told them that Andrew had gone missing, but the Gosdens never got the call. An entire day was lost because the school called the wrong family. So the family could have been looking for him. They could have alerted the police earlier, but they had no idea that Andrew hadn't shown up to school because the school called the wrong family for some reason. That's the first mistake that was made in this case. And it's kind of a big one because, as you guys know, those first few hours of someone going missing are probably the most important. So that night, the Gosden family sits down to dinner. That's Andrew's mom, Andrew's dad, and his sister Charlotte. Now, as far as they know, they think that Andrew's at home because, again, this is a kid who's very quiet. He keeps to himself. He comes home from school on his own. Then the parents who both work come home after that. So they just assume that he's probably playing video games or he's doing homework in his room. So the three of them sit down to dinner and they have dinner. And they don't even notice that Andrew's not there, which I think, to me, this stands out in this case because it really, really speaks to the kind of person that Andrew was and just kind of how quiet he was and how to himself his life was, because the fact, obviously his family cared about him. There's been a lot of distress. They've gone, to the ends of the earth to try to find this kid. They've been very involved in the search. But at that moment, that night, when he wasn't in the house, they didn't even realize right away that he wasn't there, which I think speaks volumes about Andrew himself and the kind of lifestyle that he led, right? So eventually the family realizes that Andrew's not there because they just don't see him. So they begin calling friends and neighbors. This is when they find out something even more alarming. They start calling around and they find out that Andrew hadn't gone to school that day. So that's when the family actually calls the cops. So they call the police at 7 o'clock that night and they file an official report of Andrew being missing. So they call the police at 7 o'clock that night and they file an official report of Andrew being missing. So then Andrew's father, Kevin, and his sister, Charlotte, go out and they actually start searching the area, right? The first thing they do is they walk Andrew's route. They walk his route to school. Then they go and they check around the neighborhood. Then his family and friends actually make some missing persons leaflets. Within hours of figuring out that he's not there, they start leafleting the area, okay? They search locally into the night. And then police actually start getting, then the police get involved. They search the family home. They search around the family home. They start looking for clues. Nobody finds anything. So initially, so I think it's important to note that at this point, that night, the night of the day that Andrew disappeared, nobody has any idea where Andrew went. Police don't know that he went to London. Nobody has a clue of what happened to this guy.
Yeah, and it really is kind of another part of this investigation that the family at least has pointed out as being possibly a huge mistake, right? Just like that phone call from the school going to the wrong family. All this time spent here leading to nothing, the family doesn't feel very good about it. I mean, basically what they've said in the years since this happened is that they felt like the investigators started to focus really on them, the family themselves, as possibly being the ones responsible for Andrew's disappearance, rather than taking them at their word and going out into the greater world looking for him, right? In fact, it seems like Kevin, Andrew's father, has said that it really felt like they were looking at him, right? Like potentially was there abuse going on in this house? Was there some kind of relationship between father and son that had caused Andrew to go off, or maybe they had actually taken him and done something with him? And you have to remember, all of this is taking place before it's even been discovered that Andrew took a train. So at this point, this is just a missing boy, right? For all the police know, he could be buried under the house or living with, a relative that he's run away to. They really don't know, but they're centering everything on the family. That changes about 3 days later when police, as part of their routine, investigation, sort of canvassing everything in this area, wind up speaking to a person at the train station who sells tickets. And she remembers selling a one-way ticket to London to a boy, a young teenager that matches Andrew's description. And when they dig into it, they discover it was indeed Andrew that bought this ticket. This person remembered that because she thought it was so odd that this boy would be buying a one-way ticket to London and had no interest in that return ticket. You remember earlier, Miles said there was a deal going on where he could get his return for only 50 pence. That's a screaming deal, right? Even if you were going to get a different ticket later, you might still take that. An adult experienced traveler might still take that deal just to make sure they had a cheap, easy ticket in case they wanted to use it. But Andrew didn't, and she thought that was really weird. So 3 days later, she remembered it. Now the investigators are really onto something because they realized, okay, this kid came here alone and bought a train ticket to London, which is 2 hours away. From there, they start really diving in. They discover that he got off at King's Cross Station, and they start poring over that footage like crazy to try to figure out, all right, do we see him get off the train? Do we see him move around in the city? It takes a couple passes of looking at this footage, but eventually he is spotted. He's spotted walking out of King's Cross Station. We'll show the picture now. This has now become sort of the infamous Andrew Gosden picture. You can see he's got his Slipknot shirt. He's got his messenger bag, and he doesn't appear to be too concerned. He looks like anybody else at a train station, just getting off and going where he's going to go. But here's the crazy part. He was never caught on any other camera, or at least if he has, it hasn't been discovered. And for those of you that know London, even back then, it was covered in closed circuit security cameras. Like it's famously, one of the most video camera heavy cities in the world. It's just part of the London identity. And yet somehow Andrew was never caught on any other camera. So we don't know where he went from here, right? It's like I said at the beginning of this episode, to me, this is the most frustrating thing. Here he is. We know where he went. We know what he was wearing. We know what he took with him, but we don't know where he went from here. And again, it's like, was he meeting somebody? Is he just going out to have a day on the town and see some museums? I mean, we don't know. This is the thing. With a kid who's introverted like that, you're trying to get inside of a head of a guy who doesn't usually share much of what's going on there to begin with. So I think with this knowledge now public, right, the family is baffled. They can't think of anything. The police don't know why he's there. and they start digging into possible forensic evidence that could lead them somewhere, right? Because now we're looking at a kid at 14 taking a trip into a big city. They're wondering, did he meet someone on the internet, right? I think most people's minds would go there first. Did someone lure him there? Was he being groomed, in some chat room or on MySpace, which, believe it or not, was still around back then? But the thing is, Andrew didn't have any social media accounts. And when the police got a hold of his Xbox and they contacted Sony about his, PlayStation Portable, they found out that he didn't have online access on either of those devices. They're capable of going online, but Andrew had never set up any accounts, meaning that if there was interaction with some stranger, it didn't take place on those devices. He also didn't have a cell phone. He had had a couple of these things in the past, but he always wound up losing them. He had no real interest in them because, Andrew just didn't have that big of a social group. He was a 14-year-old boy. He didn't have a huge need for a 2007 era cell phone. And when he was offered one actually by his father, he said, I'd rather get an Xbox, right? That was much more pressing need in Andrew's mind, was the video game device. And so that's what he got. I say all this to just say they looked heavily into possible points of internet access for Andrew, including going to the local public library and the computer lab at his school and combing through those computers to see if maybe Andrew had used one of those to access the internet and find somebody to talk to. But there was no evidence that he did any of that, absolutely zero. And so it doesn't mean that there wasn't possibly some stone that hasn't been, overturned, that some other person had a computer he had access to that we just haven't learned about yet. But from everything the detectives could see, Andrew wasn't really online much, much less meeting people and talking to people. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means there's no evidence of it, which makes this even more frustrating because that's the obvious thing, like I said, we all think about when we look at this situation. Someone lured this poor boy to London, but we can't find evidence that anybody actually did that. So with that sort of digital dive into the forensics of Andrew's devices, coming up with really nothing, the question still remains, right? Why did Andrew Gosden go to London that day? And why did he take steps to conceal it, right? Why did he wait for his family to leave, do it on a day where he was supposed to be in school? There's just these elements to it. It's like he didn't want anybody to know he was going. So why that, and why there, and why on that day?
Those are the big questions sort of hovering over this case and hovering over Andrew, and that is his legacy, right? Why did Andrew go to London, right? I think that's the first half of this. We don't know. We may never know. But there are possibilities, and there's been a lot of speculation, including by his family, and a lot of things have been looked into, obviously by the police and also by Andrew's family and by people online. The first theory, which I think his dad has put out there, at least did, in the early days of Andrew's disappearance, were that maybe Andrew just simply did a spontaneous adventure. From all accounts from his family, he really did like London. He knew the city pretty well. They had family there. They had grandparents, aunts, uncles, friends, that lived in the city. They had spent a lot of time there. Again, like I said, Andrew's background, even though he is from this sort of more like working class suburb of London, his parents are professionals, they're speech therapists, and, they have relatives and friends who live in the city. So, Andrew was a kid who enjoyed museums. He liked going to exhibitions. He liked wandering around the city with his family. So, the first thing that Kevin, his dad, sort of speculated was that, maybe Andrew just decided like he was going to skip school, go to London, have an adventure, and then he was going to deal with the consequences of it afterwards. And Andrew's dad, Kevin, has always said that his gut feeling was that Andrew had made a sort of spontaneous decision to go on this little journey and that it was never intended to be a permanent disappearance. And that would, that would explain not taking a coat. That would explain leaving the cash that he had and only taking the money out of the bank. Maybe, he didn't want his parents to know that he was doing this, so he took the money that his parents couldn't see, which was in the bank, and he left the cash at his house. Leaving the PSP charge, or I guess he figured he had enough of a charge to make it through the day and he was going to come back. He didn't take his passport. He didn't take any kind of luggage or anything. And like I said, he didn't take a coat or any kind of warm clothes. So, the idea he was just having like a kind of jaunt into the city for the day and he was going to kind of deal with the consequences afterwards. It does jive with that stuff, but it doesn't explain what happened afterwards, right? Which is that he permanently disappeared. There's another theory that a lot of people have thrown around, which is that maybe Andrew wanted to go to a concert. As we've said, and as his parents let the investigators know, alternative and metal music really played a big role in Andrew's life. He was a music head. This was a kid who loved music. He liked to sit in his room and listen to records. He wore band T-shirts. It was part of his identity. It was part of his life. At that time, there were several notable shows that were occurring in London around the time of his disappearance. On September 14th, this band 32nd of Mars was performing at the Brixton Academy. Another band whose name was Sixth played a rescheduled farewell show. It took place pretty close to King's Cross Station. Here's the thing, though. There's no evidence that Andrew attended either show. The police have looked into it. There's no camera footage of him around the concert venues or anything like that. There's no footage of him inside. There's no one at the venues have said that they saw him. I think even more importantly, there's no definitive evidence that he was actually a fan of either of those bands. So it's an interesting theory, but it's not an established fact. And again, this is something that's talked about online, just like the fact that like a lot of people say like, oh, he must have been speaking to people through his PSP. But the police did go through the trouble of even contacting Sony with the numbers, with the serial numbers off of Andrew's PSP, and went through everything, and he had never created an account. As far as I know, you can't chat on a PSP unless you have an account. Let us know if I'm wrong about that, but that's my understanding of how the tech works, and especially back then. But again, maybe I'm wrong. But it's the same thing with these concerts. It's a theory that's thrown around a lot, but there is no evidence that Andrew even listened to these bands. Now, there is one music event that was happening that day. There's this band called Him that was much more sort of aligned with Andrew's musical taste that was actually having a big promotional event in London, but it was a couple of days after the day that Andrew went into London. So the family actually did investigate whether Andrew could have planned to remain in London for that event and whether he had called people and was trying to stay with people or something like that. Nothing ever came of the lead, and nobody reported seeing him at the event. It was looked into, but again, most of these concerts and these musical happenings that people have pointed to as possible destinations for Andrew, they've been looked into, people have been spoken to. Nothing's really come of it. The fourth theory is the one that I think a lot of people focus on with this case, and that maybe Andrew was going into London to meet someone. So let's examine that a little bit, okay? So this is obviously, it's the most ominous possibility when we look at this case, right? Because, okay, here's a 14-year-old kid who's not telling his parents. He's taking money out of the bank, and he's driving, and he's taking a train into the big city to meet somebody, right? Who is he possibly meeting? Is it an adult? Is it another teenager who's older than him? Is it someone that he met through his school? Is it someone that he possibly met when he went and did that gifted program at the college? Is it someone that he maybe has randomly encountered in person? Or, and this is something that a lot of people focus on, is it someone that he had been secretly communicating with? Now, again, we immediately think of the online communication thing, and I keep going back to that, but the lack of digital evidence of Andrew actually communicating with anyone is a really, really big gaping hole in this case for us, because investigators have never found any evidence of any communication. He didn't have a phone. From what we can find out, he didn't have an email. He didn't have any online accounts. His PSP communications hadn't been set up. There was no computer trail at the school, and there was no computer trail at the library. Now, I know a lot of people talk about the fact that, back then, back in the early 2000s, people from this sort of late millennial generation, I guess you could say, were very, very good at sort of circumventing firewalls and, getting around ISP addresses and stuff like that. Is it possible that Andrew had a secret life as a computer expert and he was in the library and he was actually chatting with people? Yes, I would say that is possible. And I would say that maybe he had been talking to someone, but it was through extremely clandestine means that have never been found out by the authorities. Because again, no digital communication has ever been found, and that is not for want of trying. So I would say that grooming does remain possible in this case, but we can't reconstruct any interactions, and that's the problem, right? But it still stands out to me personally that when you eliminate these specific things that he may have been going to do, the fact that he took the money out of the bank, he didn't have a destination in mind necessarily. him going into London does seem like a strong possibility. But Sean, there's probably a few others that I didn't cover. What else do you think could have happened?
Well, I think, there's a couple other options here. And before we get into them, I did want to say, listening to you kind of go over all the reasons why it's been difficult to locate, a person that we can prove he was trying to meet. I think part of the problem there is that everywhere we're looking is kind of digital, right? There's so much of Andrew's life that may have taken place off of a computer, away from other people, like these walks to school, right? Where it's possible he encountered somebody. It's possible he struck up a friendship with somebody who lured him in the old fashioned analog sense, face to face, away for a day. Hey, meet me in London. I'll give you a ride back, take the train in. We'll do this, we'll do that. It's possible that that happened, right? And that the reason we haven't been able to find it is because we're just looking on computers and in phones and on Xboxes, where the real truth of it is there may be no trail at all about that kind of a relationship. The other thing I would say, another option here is that maybe, someone's going to point out Andrew possibly wanted to disappear on his own. And, I'm never a fan of this theory for most of the cases we cover on this channel. I mean, I think this one can be written off pretty quickly, right? Why would he not bring a jacket? Why would he not bring a charger? Why would he bring his house keys? Like that says he, probably intends on going home and using them again later. Why leave more money at home? Why, so much of it doesn't make sense. Why not bring an extra pair of clothes? Why not bring any of the things you would expect somebody to bring? So I'm not a fan personally of the idea that Andrew voluntarily tried to go start a new life. Doesn't mean he didn't. I just don't think that the evidence supports that. The other thing people have brought up is maybe Andrew intended to harm himself that day, right? He wanted to go to London and had no intentions of returning, but not because he wanted to keep on living, because he wanted that to be his final day on Earth. Again, I don't think there's anything that supports this, right? His family didn't say anything about being concerned about depression or his mental state. If that's the intention, bring 200 pounds and a PSP. That doesn't make a lot of sense either. I think that the other theory that makes the most sense alongside of him potentially meeting somebody is that he did wind up meeting with somebody, except it was a stranger that he didn't intend to meet that day, right? So I guess you would call this like random foul play. I think, to me, looking at what Andrew was up to, I can almost see any of us doing it, right? I know that when I was his age, maybe a little older, I skipped school. I went into the city. I did things, and I would bring some money. And usually it was pretty innocuous stuff. I'd go see a movie or meet some friends and we'd go get a burrito and skateboard or something. I don't know what he would be doing. But it does seem like totally reasonable to think that he might have just collected some money from his bank account, like Miles said, because his parents wouldn't know that that money was missing, and caught a train into the city to do something fun. And he had every intention of coming home that night. And that along the way, maybe he met somebody or ran into somebody who identified this young 14-year-old boy who looked more like 11 years old out alone and said, now there's some easy prey for me, a predator. What happened from there is anybody's guess, but it does seem, at least to me, as plausible as him being groomed and lured there by such a person. Now, we get into some other stuff here that may support kind of what I was just saying, which is that there's been some possible sightings of Andrew, and it's worth noting that these all have to be taken with a grain of salt. I mean, none of this is confirmed. London is an enormous city with millions and millions of people. Some of them are going to look like Andrew Gosden. Some of them are going to be wearing Slipknot shirts that day. Some of them are going to have that haircut. And people in the aftermath of a huge news event like this are going to remember that and say, oh, I think I saw that person. One of them might have been Andrew. One of them might not. The problem is there's hundreds, maybe even thousands of these sightings that come in. I will say that there's one in particular the family takes kind of seriously, and that's that Andrew may have been sighted eating at a Pizza Hut on Oxford Street. I'm not sure why the family gives so much credibility to this one. It may be that he liked Pizza Hut and maybe had even been to that one before and they knew that, and they would be like, okay, well, that's a place maybe he would have gone. I don't know that that's the reason. I'm just kind of spitballing there. But critically, if that was Andrew, he was alone. This person didn't say Andrew was with an older man or some other, boy or anything like that that would give us reason to believe like, okay, now we're really on the track of who is that other person. He was eating pizza by himself. Again, if that was actually him. And I say that because it would support sort of what I said earlier. It was like, maybe this kid really just wanted to go have a day of fun, play hooky, get some pizza, shop for records, do whatever a teenage boy would want to do, off leash in London for a day. It's totally possible. But then what would have happened from there again, Miles? That's where this gets tricky, because we just have no idea.
So one actual report has always stood out to me with this case, and that's on November 2008. This was more than a year after Andrew disappeared. A man actually went to a police station in Leominster, Hertfordshire, and he used an intercom outside the station, and he said that he called in and he said that he had information regarding Andrew and his disappearance. Now, before an officer could actually make it to the intercom, the guy had disappeared. From what I've been able to read, it seems like it took a long time for a cop to get there. And I don't know if I haven't been able to establish, Sean, whether the police weren't actually present at this site and someone had to make their way to the intercom and it was just a place where someone kind of could leave information, or if it was actually a building and the person there was a long walk, I guess, to get to that intercom. But either way, from what I've been able to find out, it took a long time for a cop to get there, and by the time they got there, the guy had run off. The guy had left. So the police actually did make a public appeal for the guy to come back and to give them the information, but he never did. So it's a very, very intriguing loose end that's never really been figured out. Now, years and years later, in 2018, a very, very interesting lead actually came out. Someone actually reported to the police that they had been communicating online with a person using the username Andy Rue. If you guys remember, the nickname that Andy went by in his family unit was Rue. So again, this person's username is Andy Rue, and someone's reported communicating with them because they kind of put two and two together. The person named Andy Rue online and reportedly said that their boyfriend had just left them and they needed $200 for rent. And they didn't have a bank account because they had left home at the age of 14. The username caught the attention of the person speaking to them because Andrew's family nickname was Rue, and that had been widely publicized. The police actually investigated, but the identity of the person behind the account that was used online was never actually established. Now, as we all know, especially, as we move into the 2000s, 2018, a lot of people are doing a lot of weird stuff online. So there's kind of two possibilities with this as far as I can see. Someone is like messing around and has created an online persona where they're kind of like catfishing people, acting like, dropping these little clues using the Andy Rue persona and obviously using details from Andy's backstory, or they just haven't been able to trace it, and maybe it is Andrew. Maybe he is out there. Both things are possible, I think. It's very hard to trace people. It's very easy to hide online these days. It's very easy to create different accounts, different personas, different communications. There's so many messaging apps, there's so many dating apps, there's all these social media apps. So who knows? I would say it's a fascinating lead. I don't think that it's definitive proof that Andrew is out there and he is alive, but I do think that it's the most interesting thing that's come out since Andrew disappeared.
Yeah, I would say that one is top of the pops for me, as being just totally mysterious and seems like it could be him. I mean, the nickname, the running away at 14, the amount of money mentioned, it's all really right on, and it's, unless somebody was intentionally trolling, I'm not sure what to make of that. There was another big development recently, actually, I should mention. In 2021, there was some arrests that were reported in London of two men, aged 38 and 45, and they were suspected of being involved in kidnapping and other indecent crimes involving people who are not of age, trying to get around YouTube's, very, very strict way of handling the subject matter. Hopefully you guys know what I'm talking about. These guys were alleged to be involved in some really bad stuff, including possessing hard drives with lots of images that would be illegal. And they had been reportedly suspected of being involved in Andrew Gosden's disappearance because they were identified through an anonymous tipster, right? And this person, I think, said, these guys know what happened to him. So this was huge news. It looked like for a moment this case was about to be cracked because of what these guys were involved in. It would be a very sad ending, of course, for the Gosden family, but at least it would be some sort of an ending. So what gets weird here, though, is that the more the police dig into these two guys, the less these allegations sort of materialize, right? Like a lot of the stuff that they're alleged to have been involved in winds up not having a lot of evidence behind it. And it gets to the point where by 2023, they actually like drop the charges. These guys are not going to face a trial. The police just don't have enough to get them on anything. And more importantly, they concluded this by saying they knew or they felt definitively that these two guys had nothing to do with Andrew Gosden's disappearance. So whatever tips they had received, whatever information had been given to them along those lines turned out to be bogus, basically, as far as we can tell. Now, it's always tough, like when you talk about these cases, to write stuff like that off because it feels so tantalizingly close. But again, you have to look at evidence and you can only follow where the evidence leads. And the fact of the matter is, they spent a lot of time and a lot of resources trying to make that connection, and it just wasn't there, you know? So pending something further developing, it looks like that's a dead end. Now, where does the investigation stand today? Well, dead end might be, unfortunately, one of the words we'd use. Obviously, it's still open. The police are still accepting tips. They're still looking for Andrew. But, you know, let's be honest, this is now a 19-year-old case with not a lot of new information. And outside of the couple things that we just told you about, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of forward motion on it, which is interesting because a lot of people are interested, right? Miles, I mean, here we are talking about it, right? Two guys from the other side of the world 19 years later, and we're talking about Andrew's case. So it's not for lack of public interest. It is one of these more infamous, web sleuthed, talked about, community heavy cases because, you know, of a few reasons. I think, first of all, it's an incredibly baffling mystery that just makes no sense. Second of all, it involves a child, right? Which is always extra sort of horrifying and gets everybody's attention. And third of all, it looks like Andrew may have had a hand in it, right? He may have been complicit in some sort of a plot to leave that day and go somewhere, which makes it even more of an attention getter. So at the end of the day, that's kind of where this stands. Open, but maybe not a super hot case at the moment. I mean, Miles, what do you think about when you look at this one? I have so many thoughts.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm really torn. I think that the idea that he was speaking to someone, that Andrew had some sort of like secret communication with someone, that he was headed to meet someone, it does seem like the most logical answer for this kind of disappearance, right? I do go back to that time that he spent in that gifted program when he was at the college, and like maybe he had met an older person there, you know, older than him, and that maybe that was when he made contact with someone, if there wasn't some secret digital communication going on. It's interesting because this is such a case of its time, where if this was happening today, I don't think there's anyone who doesn't have digital communication now. Like, you wouldn't have a 14-year-old kid who wouldn't at least have an email address and a Facebook account or an Instagram account or a TikTok account or something, right? It just doesn't exist. So, you know, this is really an anomaly of its time. And I think even for its time, Andrew was a bit of a sort of like pseudo Luddite in the fact that like he didn't have this stuff. He wasn't interested in it because kids were already carrying around phones at that point and everything else. So it's an interesting look into something that couldn't happen now, right? I think that's really important when we're looking at this case. I think that the most likely, or the most obvious thing would be that he was going to meet somebody. But I also think what the dad's leaning towards lately, and you know, the last few times that he's spoken publicly about the case, it does seem that the father, Kevin, is leaning towards the idea that this was a spontaneous trip. He was going to have a jaunt into the city, and he met with foul play. I guess that's possible, but having just spent like months and months living in London and working there and living as a local, just doesn't, to me, that city is not a place where that happens very often. It just doesn't feel like an unsafe place. I think you have to really, really go to certain areas for that to happen. And it seems like Andrew knew the city well enough that he probably wasn't going to put himself in harm's way. He probably would have stayed in like pretty busy, more safer areas. So look, anything's possible, right? His dad has said that he wasn't streetwise. He was naive. You know, maybe that's why he leans towards that. Anything's possible. Look, maybe Andrew was struggling with something. You know, we just don't know. I mean, you know, this kid was so quiet. and he had such a sort of private life to himself, even within his family. Maybe he had some things going on that nobody knew about. And maybe he was running away from something, or maybe he was running to something. That's possible. I'm not trying to allude to anything, but we just don't know, and like the father's made public appeals to various communities, basically saying like, hey, can you help us? We're not a judgmental family. Like maybe my son was struggling with things that he was afraid we would judge him for. So, anything's possible. I would throw it to our audience, what do you guys think? What do you think could have happened to this kid? I mean, why did he get on that train? Why did he take that money out of the bank? Why did he get on that train? And why did he go to London? What was his intention? What was he going there for? If we could figure that out, then maybe it could be figured out where he is.
Yeah. I think you make a lot of really great points there. And I think I'm sort of split in my own mind about whether he was meeting somebody or whether he was just playing hooky, like I think from the outside, it seems nefarious because he went missing, but if that was just a normal day and he came home, all of it would still line up. He waited for his parents to leave. He got dressed. He took some money and something to play with on the train. He went into town and came back, and that would look totally normal. It's the fact that he did that stuff and then never came back that to me colors it all. Like, okay, why did he take the money? Why did he take the PSP but not the charger? Why did he wait for his parents to leave? Like all that could have a really mundane explanation. And he just ran into something on his trip that he did not expect. But again, easily is likely to me that somebody lured him there, especially because I do think it's really weird that he decided to take these 4-mile walks home from school when that was not normally his habit. What was that all about? Very unusual. 4 miles, it's not a huge distance, but it's also like that's going to take you some time on foot. If you're running, that could easily take you 30, 40 minutes at a slow pace. Walking, it's going to be maybe an hour. I don't know, guys, check me on the math. It's been a while since I've been on my treadmill, but there had to have been a reason for that, I would think. Whether or not it's connected, I don't know, but it does stick out to me as one space in his life where no one actually knows what was really happening, And
Yeah.
therein lies the danger, right? When you're talking about adults and kids and that kind of a thing, it's moments where you're not around other kids, your parents aren't watching you, you're very vulnerable. And there you go. There's a couple of those moments right there. So we're curious what you guys think. As always, we would love to hear, especially from our British viewers. I will say, if you guys want to weigh in on this one, even if it's just correcting our pronunciation on some of your geographical locations, we're open to that. But sound off. I mean, did we miss anything? Is there more developing in the story that you guys know about? Or do you just want to tell us what you think happened? We'd love to hear it.
Absolutely. Guys, please remember, if you like what we're doing, give the video a like, drop a comment, subscribe. If you really like what we're doing, become a member. And please don't ever forget, we are also an audio podcast. You can find us anywhere where you download your podcast. That's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, all the usual places. If you're sick of looking at us, but you like hearing these stories and you like listening to us, go over there, download it onto your phone, listen to us while you're driving, listen to us while you're at the gym, whatever. We will appreciate. The ending of that was terrible, guys. If you please remember, we're also an audio podcast. So if you're sick of looking at our faces, but you want to hear what we're doing, just go wherever you get your podcast. You can find us Apple, Amazon, all the usual places. We really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you guys for watching, and we will see you in the comments.
Thanks, everybody.